Hello, and thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm Spencer Overton. I'm a professor and the founder and faculty director here at the Multiracial Democracy Project at GW Law. We focus on solutions that facilitate our nation's transition to a well-functioning democracy that truly represents our increasingly diverse population. The project serves as a bridge between academic, civil rights, democracy reform, technology, philanthropic, and policy communities. And we're growing. Lisa Bornstein is our executive director. She's now joined by our new assistant director, Britta Odendy. Britta joins us from the Scholars Strategy Network. Now, working with Lisa, Britta will manage our 3-year alternative systems project, where we're working with numerous Asian American, Black, Latino, and tribal voting rights and community groups here, as well as the Houston Institute at Harvard Law School, to examine the racial implications of reforms like proportional representation, fusion voting, and Final Four primaries. Our goal is to be prepared with a game plan if the U.S. Supreme Court continues to scale back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We also want to help the voting rights community build capacity so they can play a leadership role in informed democracy reform debates, which currently, unfortunately, do not reflect the diversity of our nation. Shoot me an email if you want to learn more about this project or our work on AI and multiracial democracy. So today I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second installment of our Democracy in Color series. Our goal is to create this space for folks from different areas to come together and consider the role of ethnic identity in the 2024 presidential election and in other contexts as a data point in thinking about how we build a multiracial democracy. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I want to deal with a couple of housekeeping items. Our next webinar will be held on Thursday, February 13th at 12 noon. We're thrilled that Professor Ishmael White, the professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University, will join us to talk about Black voters in the 2024 election. We'll send out that invite, but I did want to flag that for you now. In March, we'll be joined by Zoltan Heinel. He is a professor at UC San Diego, and he'll talk about racially polarized voting today. So that's coming up as well. So those are the upcoming events. I also wanted to mention that we're going to make a minor change to our format today. Rather than just record the opening statement and then go off record for the interactive conversation, today we're going to record the entire session. We found that last month's interactive conversation with Ashley Jardina was really rich, and moving forward, we'd like to share the conversation with others. Now, we don't want to chill discussion of sensitive items, and so if you'd like to ask a question but remain anonymous, just send your question or comment directly to me in the comments box, and I'll, indicate that you'd like to remain anonymous without identifying you, and I'll read your question or comment to the group without mentioning your name. So now, for today's featured speaker, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Bernard Fraga. He's the Anne and Michael Hankin Distinguished Professor of Political Science and the faculty coordinator of the Latinx Studies Initiative at Emory University. Professor Fraga studies various topics related to American elections, focusing on racial and ethnic politics, voter turnout, and the impact of election laws on voters and politicians. His award-winning 2019 book, The Turnout Gap, provides just a comprehensive analysis of Black, Latino, and Asian American voting patterns and explains the causes of large and persistent gaps in voter turnout in our diversifying electorate. Dr. Fraga's work has been featured in prominent academic journals and in media outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, and The Economist. He's also served as an expert consultant on multiple election law and voting rights cases, and he regularly advises organizations dedicated to enhancing the civic and electoral engagement of all Americans. Professor Fraga will present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have an interactive conversation. So without further ado, Professor Fraga, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Spencer and Lisa and the rest of the folks from the GW Multiracial Democracy Project. This is a wonderful opportunity to, I think, or at least I hope, have a really frank conversation about the state of our democracy. And in this talk, I'll be focusing mostly on the Latino or the Latinx population, but in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk about what we see for other racial and ethnic groups and broader implications for our democracy too. So, I want to begin this talk by talking about the diversification that we see. So when I teach racial and ethnic politics or Latino politics at Emory here, I begin by starting with this chart, which shows the proportion of the US population that is non-white. So that's the not non-Hispanic white population over time. And I think what's important to note is that when we had many of the, pieces of legislation, of course, the African American Civil Rights Movement as well, these kind of fundamental transformative moments in our American democracy, the United States looked very different than what it does today. It was only about 15% non-white, according to the US Census. And in 2020, it's more like 40% non-white. So we are indeed rapidly diversifying, even in the span of, perhaps 2 or 3 generations. The other thing that I'd like to note is the fact that the nature of this racial and ethnic diversity has changed quite a bit as well. While in the 1960s and 1970s, it might have been fair, at least in terms of numbers, to talk about really a divided country between black and white, the vast, vast majority of racial ethnic minorities in the US were African American. Today, the largest racial and ethnic minority group is, of course, the Latino population, growing Asian American population, but the nature of discussions of diversity, the dynamics of coalition building, of power building, are necessarily, just because of the numbers we see in this chart, very, very different than they were in the 1960s. So when I do my work and my research, I focus on voting, voter turnout, as you heard Spencer mention, and I think about the implications of those demographic changes on our democracy going forward. In today's talk, I'm going to begin by discussing the shift we see in terms of the vote choice of Latino voters in particular between 2016 and 2020. And as I hope to demonstrate, there was a big shift, a shift that's substantial and significant, with implications, of course, for 2024, implications that we saw even before the election was held. I'm then going to talk about the trends that we do see now after the 2024 election, particularly with the Latino vote. And then I'm going to be discussing a case that I think is informative for thinking about the future of the Latino vote. And this is the case of Ruben Gallego, recently elected senator from Arizona, and some of the stances he's been taking and the support that he gained from Latinos. Okay, so to begin, I want to talk about the Latino vote, first of all. This is a chart looking with exit poll data at the Latino vote from the 1980s to 2016 in terms of presidential election vote choice. Red bars are the percent supporting Republicans. Blue bars are the percent supporting Democrats. This is just the two-party vote shares that, Latinos, who they voted for in each of those years. And what we can see is, of course, a long-standing trend that Latinos have supported Democratic candidates much more than Republican candidates. This is true in 2020 and 2024 as well. But the idea is that there's kind of been an up and down nature to this. Looking at this time span, this doesn't show 2020 or 2024, but if you look at this, you'd identify 2004, the Bush v. Kerry kind of matchup in 2004 as the year in which Latinos gave their largest proportion of the vote to Republicans, hitting about 40%, and just over or just under 60% giving their vote to the Democrat John Kerry in that year. 2016, we didn't see the lowest Latino support for Republican ever, but it was relatively low by historical standards. And the narrative we've had in the literature on Latino politics and race and ethnic politics more broadly is that if Republicans were going to win the Latino vote, the method that they would have to use is something similar to what we saw with George W. Bush in 2004, and an earlier kind of Republican narrative that said they needed to emphasize, Republicans that is, family values, needed to emphasize religion, hard work, these kinds of conservative values that the Latino community, perhaps by nature of being an immigrant origin group, or for other reasons like being predominantly Catholic, would be very receptive to. The idea was to not talk about immigration in a kind of a disparaging way, to not talk about Latinos as a group in a disparaging way, instead to portray them as this kind of, American dream kind of story. So you imagine the surprise that many people felt when we woke up the day after the election on 2020, and some of the results we saw indicated that Latinos may have actually given a larger share of their vote to Donald Trump, a man who began his campaign in 2015 disparaging immigrant groups, Latinos in particular, Mexicans in particular, that they gave a larger share of the vote to Donald Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016, and perhaps more than other Republicans in the past too. And what I'm talking about here is, the map that this is from the New York Times that I think many of us saw with these arrows, as it got filled in from the East Coast to the West Coast, showing that in South Florida, for example, big red arrow there pointing to the right, but also in South Texas, a lot of shift towards Donald Trump, despite the fact that nationally, of course, Joe Biden won not only the popular vote like Clinton did in 2016, but also the Electoral College. So the idea being that the nation moved blue, but Latinos moved right. That was the narrative that we saw really just right after the election too. And then as data kind of came in, some doubted this effect, but by the end of the day, and this is from a 2022 report by Catalyst, this is seen as kind of I would say a highly reliable, multi kind of sourced set of information, voter file survey based, suggested that Latinos between 2016 and 2020 had the largest shift towards Republicans of any of these kind of racial or even education-based breakdowns that you can do, shifting 8 percentage points from the Democrats to the Republicans, giving 63% of the vote to Democrats, but still 8 percentage points lower than what Latinos gave to Hillary Clinton in 2016. And we could see other racial and ethnic minority groups shifted a little bit to the right, but no one to the degree that Latinos did. Now, we addressed this phenomenon in a recent paper that's published in the American Political Science Review, where what we find, and I'll be highlighting some of these results, but just briefly, what we find is that this shift by Latinos towards the Republican Party was more durable than perhaps many people assumed, that it wasn't just a one-off, that it was likely, and we wrote this before the 2024 election, likely to be a durable trend that we saw going forward. And, we began by just talking about the evidence we see, which is that, looking again nationally, similar to that arrow plot, Trump overperformed relative to how he did in 2016, basically only in the heavily Latino areas of the country. Everywhere else, he did kind of the same, but here the blue line is just a moving average. As you increase the percent of 2020 voters who were Latino or Latinx, Trump's vote share gain, which is what's on the y-axis, Trump's vote share gain increases and increases and increases until you get to the point where it's, at some of these very heavily Latino precincts, and this is Latino voters, not just Latino kind of population, we're talking maybe 10 percentage points, 20, in some places even 30 percentage points more support for Trump than what we saw in 2016. And if we just highlight Texas here, which is now the red line and the red dots, each of those dots is like a census tract or a neighborhood, we see that those gains, in many cases, were very strong in Texas, right? Particularly in heavily Latino parts of Texas, like the Rio Grande Valley, where Trump gained, again, as much as 30 percentage points over his performance in 2016. So the idea, it's a heavily Mexican population on the border. This is a place where Trump's rhetoric was well known. It's not just a story about Cubans or South American immigrants. This is really a story about the kind of heavily Democratic, historically leaning Latino populations shifting not a little bit, but 30 percentage points in some cases towards Trump. Now, I want to hammer this point home before continuing on too much further, which is the fact that there's some kind of misunderstandings about the Latino electorate. Latinos are not a monolith. I want to say that. Very, very diverse population. But just to give you a sense of how large a share Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Mexican origin people are in the Latino population. This is from the American Community Survey, looking at the citizen voting age population for Latinos. 58%, in the most recent data we have, 58% of Latinos in the US eligible to vote are of Mexican origin. The next largest group, Puerto Ricans, 12%. That excludes people living on the island of Puerto Rico, or the archipelago. Cubans are the third largest at 4.4, and every other group here that's distinguishable is a smaller share. So Mexicans and Mexican Americans are not only the majority, but by far the largest group, with Puerto Ricans second, combined Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, and you've got about 70% of the Latino electorate. Just looking at the numbers here, we can talk about Cubans, Venezuelans, Colombians, other groups that have kind of very different kind of immigration and US experience histories, more recent kind of arrivals in the US. But the bottom line is when we talk about a Latino shift, we can't see a shift as large as what I just showed you unless it's a story about Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, the larger groups in the Latino electorate shifting. There's just not enough of other groups for that to explain the whole shift we saw. Okay, so real quick, because I want to get to 2024, the shifts we saw, and these are point estimates from the paper of who Trump had the most gains from within the Latino community, what we saw is that low socioeconomic status Latinos disproportionately shifted towards Trump between 2016 and 2020, and second generation, that is US-born children of immigrants, are the ones who shifted to Trump the most in 2020. So in some ways, this is a shift that if we were looking at the white population, especially on income and education, we'd say is not surprising. Trump made gains among exactly the Latinos 2020 that he made gains with socioeconomically in terms of whites in 2016, right? He won low SES white voters that hadn't voted before or had voted Democrat in 2016. In 2020, he did the same thing with Latinos. And we also see that this is part of a broader pattern of polarization. That is, Republican Latinos, relative to 2016, became a much larger share of Trump's kind of Latino voter pool. And conservative Latinos also became a larger share of Trump's voter pool. Democrats, more liberal Latinos, they shifted the other way. These are negative estimates here. They shifted more towards Biden. So indeed, we're seeing polarization. Some have called it a kind of normalization of the Latino vote. If you're conservative and Latino, you vote Republican more than you did pre-2020. And the last thing I want to show from the paper is the fact that this also extends to policy. That is, Latinos who, for example, were more conservative on crime policy, favored more funding for the police or qualified immunity, became much more likely to vote for Trump and support Trump. Those who disagreed with that, who said defund the police, became much more likely to vote for Biden. On immigration, those who were restrictionist shifted towards Trump. Those who were less restrictionist on immigration shifted in the Democratic side. So we're also seeing this polarization on issue positions that aligns vote choice with political or policy preferences. That is, Latinos who are conservative ideologically, conservative on immigration, lower socioeconomic status, again, if they were non-Hispanic white, we'd say, that's a classic Trump voter. Well, Latinos with those positions are shifting towards Trump too. Now, between 2020 and 2024, of course, we had a congressional election. Did we see the same patterns hold? This is again from Catalyst, right? Compiling data, voter file data, surveys. What do they find? Latino vote in 2022, here at the bottom of the chart, 62%. For Democrats, the same as what they found for 2020. And we see a pretty consistent pattern across groups, which is a shift towards Republicans, but the sustained shift, even in a midterm election when Trump is not on the ballot. Of course, Republicans are on the ballot. Trump is still somewhat seen as a leader of the party, although January 6th changed that some. But the idea is, again, Latino voters continuing to support Republicans even without Trump on the ballot. And looking at Texas, just briefly, this is precinct level data. About, I think, something like 10,000 precincts in Texas, looking again at the share Latino and the percent voting Republican. I don't want to ignore the fact that heavily Latino areas are still mostly Democratic, but the idea is the red line and the pink line here, 2020 and 2022, show almost the same trend. Very different from other years, other recent elections, in Texas at least, heavily Latino areas shifted 10 points, maybe more, towards Trump relative to pre-2020 patterns. So all of that kind of sets up now 2024. 2024, of course, Donald Trump wins the election, wins the popular vote, wins the Electoral College nationally. So we would expect a shift towards Trump basically among all groups could be fueling that change in the results. When it comes to catering to Latinos, though, Trump, while talking about Latinos and shifting his rhetoric in a slight but maybe important way to talk about Latino Americans for Trump, continued to have a hardline stance on immigration, talked a lot about crimes committed by unauthorized or TPS immigrants, right, in the United States, didn't really change his rhetoric when it came to the Latino population. What did we see? In some ways, the same kind of, because this is also from the New York Times, arrows pointing to the right in heavily Latino areas, but now pointing to the right so much that we're talking about flipping some of these historically Democratic counties into the Republican column. That includes in South Texas here, the yellow counties are the ones that flipped from Democrat to the Republican for the first time, in most cases, in 2 or 3 generations. So basically all of Texas shifted to the right, but the largest arrows, the largest shifts are in these majority Hispanic areas of the state. This map, I'll zoom in here in just a second, but kind of shows this red shift in Texas. If you're sitting here after Hillary Clinton's campaign, 2016, and saying, what's the path forward for Democrats in Texas, for example? You'd say South Texas. That's where the big pool of potential, Democratic voters is based on their voting trends. By 2024 here in South Texas, it's completely flipped. Now those areas of South Texas that even in 2020, more Republican, but still majority Democratic, have flipped. Now went majority Republican. That is majority supporting Donald Trump. Now, I showed an earlier version of this chart in talks before the 2024 election, but I think a large part of the story between 2016 and 2020, and this is just in South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley, was that the Republicans were picking up Latino voters that hadn't really participated before. Latinos who didn't turn out to vote. So they were increasing their votes. Democrats' turnout was a record high in 2020, increasing a little bit, but just not as much. The idea is there was a pool of latent Republicans who didn't vote and then started voting, maybe because the Republicans made outreach to them. But when you get to 2024, you see, the lines cross. What we see is that now Democrats are starting to lose votes in these, again, 85, 90% Latino areas of the state of Texas, and the Republicans are continuing to gain. Now, there are still many, many people who didn't vote, so all of that could be new voters, and it could be Democrats staying home instead of flipping. But it does say that this is not just an issue of if you mobilize, they'll turn out for Democrats. This is a much bigger story here about actual shifting in behavior and actual shift in this important region of the state. But it's not just Texas. Southern California, Arizona as well to some degree, was supposed to be kind of resistant in terms of the Latino population to these broader shifts. Imperial County, the border county in the state of California, 86% Latino. If you see a shift there, it's got to be the Latino voters there. It's a small county, about 100,000 registered voters, but we saw a 25 percentage point shift in that county in terms of the vote outcome between 2020 and 2024 in Trump's direction. It went from a county that was, here you can see in the bottom of the tweet, I'm retweeting here, 24 percentage points in favor of Joe Biden in 2020, now favored Trump narrowly in 2024. And if you look at there's a much larger, set of results here. Throughout California, you saw a shift towards the Republicans, but again, concentrated in the heavily Latino areas, right? 25 percentage point shift in California, that's a lot. Now, we don't have the same kind of level of detail that Catalyst was providing us about where we saw the shifts in terms of racial and ethnic groups, but the AP VoteCast surveys, which are like the exit poll kind of alternative, they're much larger scale and they are more representative. This is data from Jonathan Robinson put together, but what we see is that the change in terms of the share voting for Democrats in 2020 and 2024 across racial, ethnic, and gender groups shows some pretty interesting patterns. There was a very large shift among Black men, certainly, there towards the Republicans between 2020 and 2024, but also by Latino men and Latinas as well, shifting 9 percentage points and 6 percentage points, respectively, towards the Republicans. And while Black men still 3/4 supported Democrat Kamala Harris in 2024, that 12-point shift, right, brought them closer to what we saw for other racial and ethnic minority groups. And again, Trump made gains basically across the board, including with white women. So we really shouldn't ignore the fact that if we talk about gender dynamics, Black men, Latino men are much, much more likely to vote Democrat than white men, and Black women and Latino women much, much more likely to vote Democrat than white women as well. Okay. The last part of the talk before we open it up for the Q&A, I want to discuss this kind of curious case of Arizona. So Arizona is a kind of unique place for a lot of reasons. The Latino population there is substantial, although not as large as Texas or New Mexico, but a substantial part of the population. And while white voters are split basically 50-50, a little bit of a loss among white voters for Democrats can be compensated for by higher support by Latinos. Important note. Ruben Gallego was nominated by the Democrats to be their nominee for the Senate election in 2024, facing Carrie Lake, notorious election denier. Republican nominee was a Republican nominee in the previous cycle as well, statewide. And Gallego won very narrowly, despite the fact that Trump won the state. So it's one of these places where people identified and say, Gallego did something in Arizona that allowed him to buck the trend of other Democrats, including Harris, that pushed him to victory. Gallego himself says he has the magic formula for Democrats to win back Latinos, particularly Latino men, and has advice to people about what to do. I'm not going to get into all of his advice here, but I will say that he had a reputation, even years before that election, for being somewhat of a contrarian regarding the kind of, how would we put it? The backlash, well, the kind of frontlash backlash to this kind of more inclusive politics that we saw discussed really since the 2016 election, but certainly since 2020. For example, this became a little bit famous, saying, you know, to be clear, my office is not allowed to use the term Latinx in official communications. We only use Latino. Latinx is something created by the progressives, white rich progressives in particular, and it's a problem, and this is why we're losing Latino men. He didn't say that's why we're losing Latino men specifically, but he did say that Democrats have lost their way by catering to what they think Latino voters want instead of what they actually want. We can talk about this more in the Q&A. Just looking at the Arizona trends, and sorry these charts are a little bit small, but they're from this excellent group, Equis Research. They do fantastic work. Carlos Odio and his team in particular have been polling and looking at the Latino electorate for a long time. What they find is that Harris severely underperformed Biden and, of course, Hillary Clinton in heavily Latino areas of Arizona. And Gallego did better than Harris did in 2024 in exactly those heavily Latino areas. That's what the chart on the right shows. However, what I would like to emphasize is the fact that even though he did better, the purple line here, Biden still outperformed even what Gallego did in 2024. So the idea is perhaps Gallego was able to stop the bleeding somewhat in terms of the performance Kamala Harris had in heavily Latino areas of the state, but he wasn't able to match the numbers that Joe Biden did when he won the state in 2020. So I think there's some real questions there about the amount of impact we could expect from someone like Ruben Gallego, the rhetoric that he's using in terms of solving this issue of Latinos shifting to the right, at least if you're on the Democratic side of things. And then the last thing that I want to mention in terms of Ruben Gallego, you know, what has he done since he came into office in December? Well, you know, the one thing that he did was he is actually signed on as a co-sponsor of the Laken-Riley Act. The Laken-Riley Act, some of you probably know, is, well, It's a bill dealing with the undocumented population in the U.S. and making it easier to detain and deport individuals for minor crimes. Gallego, again, one of the most prominent Latinos now in the Senate, saying not only is he going to vote for it, he's going to co-sponsor it. And indeed he did, and that act passed. So if this is kind of the policy position that Latinos or politicians catering to Latinos need to take in order to win, I disagree with that notion, but that's a very, very different stance than I think what advocates certainly have been saying for a long time. So that's what I have for you. I'm looking forward to having a rich discussion and talking about these findings further.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for that presentation. So to just get in the queue, just raise your hand here. Raise your virtual hand if you have a question that is you'd like to remain anonymous. Just chat. Send me a message in the chat directly here. So we have a James. Great to see you. Let's turn it over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Professor Fergus, for the presentation. The question I have is, there's been at least some conversation that one of the reasons for the shift in this particular election was that not just Latino men, but that men of color, for whatever reason, may have still had high reservations about voting for a woman. And I wonder if any of your research or findings goes to the notions of how gender may have played a role in the shifts, especially as it relates to voting for Donald Trump.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. I wanted to go back to this this chart that I showed you. This doesn't break it down by gender, right? But it does show kind of the long-term trend from 2012 to 2022 in terms of Latino support for Democrats. And one of the things that we see, which was confirmed by many, many studies, is that the highest, right, recent support for a Democrat by Latinos was in the 2016 election, when Hillary Clinton was on the ticket, was the nominee of the party. And at the time, many people thought, well, that's probably a story about Latino opposition to Donald Trump and his immigration stance. I don't think that fits with the story we see in 2020 or 2024, but I do think it's instructive at saying that, there's an intersectional kind of story that could be told there, but not one that is just purely about a gender story. Of course, I think when we talk about the historic nomination and candidacy of Kamala Harris, right? We have to address the fact that the intersection between misogyny and racism may be particularly strong for Latino men, that there's Latino men who are, I guess we could say, racist, and those Latino men also tend to be sexist. But my argument would be they were probably never going to vote for a Democrat anyway. If they were going to turn out to vote at all, there was basically no Democrat that would satisfy their mind. So they might have been very vocal in their opposition to Harris, but there's still just one vote. I'm more interested in the patterns that we see in terms of Latinas also not supporting Harris and dropping in their support. And I think that we have to tell a story too about the broader kind of environment and landscape that Harris found herself in, right? With only a little more than 100 days in order to run her campaign, and then really being in the shadow of Joe Biden for that entire time. I think that it really compounds a lot of the kind of underlying racism and misogyny that's not so much about Harris's identity as a person, but the role Harris was expected to play and what voters were expecting of her versus Joe Biden. So I hope that answers your question, but it's a very good one. It's just tough to see in the data a kind of simple story or a simple fix for the Democrats.
Okay, just looking for hands and anything in the chat here. Okay, now here is an anonymous question here. Why are low on income Latinos becoming pro massive deportation and closed border?
That's a good question. So, I mean, there's two ways of thinking about this. One is, what is the extent to which Democrats or Latino, let's just say Latinos as a population, support the kind of most punitive and most severe forms of Trump's immigration policy proposals. Things like deporting 20 million people. There's not 20 million undocumented individuals in the US. So maybe he's just overestimating that number, or he's saying he's going to go into communities and take people who maybe have protected status, or family members, children will go with their parents, even if the children are citizens. These are in some ways terrifying policy proposals for all sorts of reasons. And I think when you look at opinion polling, the limited polling that there is about that kind of scale, there's more skepticism in the public, particularly among Latinos. But the actions that Trump has talked about taking and that many people have seen as realistic are much more narrow. And I think when you look at that, things like limitations on asylum or increased border security to prevent individuals from coming to the US, that's where you see obviously much more support across groups, but also support among Latinos. Other polling, and I don't have a slide on it here, has shown that Latinos, like many Americans, differentiate between the border security dynamic, where they feel Joe Biden in particular has been extremely poor, and what to do about the unauthorized population that's already in the US, particularly long term. And we've had polling going back decades that says most Americans, even a substantial percentage of whites, are willing to say, well, maybe something should be done about normalizing the status of long-term undocumented individuals who haven't committed crimes, right? That's why things like the Laken Riley Act is so interesting. I think that Latinos are now separating out the kind of border security rhetoric from the rhetoric on immigration, and also saying Democrats promised to do something about amnesty or resolving the status of long-term undocumented individuals living in the US, but haven't done anything about it. A lot of polling suggests that Latinos feel Democrats have broken their promises, and they say, well, we might as well go with the person that's at least committing to doing something related to immigration that we want, which is a more secure border.
So here's another anonymous question. I'm curious about the weight you'd put on narrative versus outreach, if at all. You mentioned family values, religion, and hard work resonating with Latino communities, and also the fact that there was outreach to Latino communities by Republicans. Do progressive messages not resonate, or was there little or no outreach to Latino communities that their votes were expected and taken for granted, similar to Black voters?
Well, that's a really good question. It's a good question. I think there's two parts to this. I think if you talk to folks who were involved in the Harris campaign, particularly canvassers, and I live here in Georgia, I live in Atlanta, they would contest the notion that Black voters were taken for granted by the campaign in particular. I think we can say more broadly, there has not been as much work done to empower and build robust kind of, political institutions, right, that support continuous efforts to mobilize and engage with Black voters on the issues they care about. But I would say when it comes to election time, there wasn't a story of Harris taking Black voters for granted. I think it's a similar story with Latinos. But I think with Latinos, the difference is that it was harder to make a case with many of the Latinos that were willing to vote for Trump that they should instead vote Democrat. That's why I started with the shift from 2016 to 2020. I don't think the Democrats are well positioned in any way, policy-wise. There's no message where they can win back Latinos who are conservative on crime, conservative on immigration, identify as conservative, right? Are lower income, lower SES, so are already kind of in that populist Trump kind of mindset already. It's going to be very, very difficult for Democrats to craft a message that could somehow win that group, particularly because if they did, they'd basically just be Republican light. And I know some of you on the call probably think, well, that's kind of what Joe Biden did, especially on immigration. He said, I'm going to secure the border. I'm going to, prevent, asylum seekers from coming into the US. They kind of tried that. I don't think a lot of those Latino voters who voted for Trump are winnable. I think the bigger question is, what can Democrats do to build a kind of long-term infrastructure for the more, I would say, amenable to democratic policy portions of the Latino electorate. That is, what about the non-voting Latinos who are already aligned with the Democratic Party or could be aligned with the Democratic Party that was perhaps closer to the rhetoric of Bernie Sanders? This is an argument Chuck Rocha makes. Or closer to the rhetoric, even on some issues, of Ruben Gallego, right? Gallego's a Democrat. He sponsored the Lincoln Riley Act, but on many, many other issues, he's well to the left. Similar to kind of a mainstream Democrat from a more heavily Democratic state. So I think that it's a complicated narrative about what the next steps are. But to me, there's some hard choices there for Democrats about whether they can really just continue with what they've been doing and expect things to change.
Okay, I think we've got a couple of questions here in the chat, but I do not see anonymous here next to them. I guess they are two hosts and panelists. So since they're to host and panelists as opposed to generally, I'll assume that they are anonymous here just out of abundance. Anyone who is not anonymous, feel free to engage here. So there can be white Latinos, Afro-Latinos. How's that reflected in the voting share numbers? What role does identity play, if any? And also, do you see any differences in voting among generations, younger, being more progressive, older, more conservative, that type of thing? So what role does race play in the Latino community in terms of voting behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, two pieces of this. First of all, when we talk about the Latino population, it's not a monolith, obviously. There's tremendous diversity within the Latino population. I want to separate out two components of the racial dynamic here. So, of course, yes, there's an Afro-Latino population. The Afro-Latino population in the U.S. is larger than the self-identified Afro-Latino population in the U.S., right? That is, there are more Latinos who might be perceived on the street, what we call street race, as Black or of African descent than people who identify. A lot of research has indicated that, it's difficult to poll the Afro-Latino population. We don't have like a reference sample by national origin or what that should really look like. So I don't have that data here. I think it's an important question. It's an especially important question when thinking about the influx of Puerto Ricans into places like Florida now, where there's over 1 million Puerto Ricans who are recent arrivals from the island in the wake of Hurricane Maria earthquake in 2020 and other, economic situations brought on by austerity. I think there's a lot of questions there that we need to get at, but the estimates we have are that the population is relatively small, so that we can't self-identify it, so we can't attribute it all can attribute that to what we're seeing here. On the white Latino question, well, I want to separate that out into there's a population of Latinos who don't identify as Latino and instead identify as white, ostensibly non-Hispanic white. That's very complicated because that's difficult to measure. Obviously, it has to do more with assimilation and acculturation. That group tends to be more conservative. We've known that for a long time. This idea that while we're talking about Latinos who identify as Latino and white, and are not multiracial like myself, that is more, to me, a construct of the way the census asks the question about race. And the evidence that I've seen and the story that I'll maintain is that someone checking a box like white after being asked if they're Latino without the option to say some other race or being pushed to not say some other race is not the same as someone saying, I am white, I am perceived as white in society. So I don't want to reduce, the examination of racial difference within the Latino population to a Black-white binary, certainly. And I also don't think that that is the most useful way for getting at these really important divisions within the community. On the second part, in terms of age and generation, no question that younger Latinos are more progressive when you look at issue stances. And older Latinos, especially foreign-born older Latinos who have naturalized, not just Cubans, Mexicans as well, are more conservative and have trended more conservative. But young Latinos are far less likely to vote and far less likely to identify with the Democratic Party despite progressive stances. So for younger Latinos, there's a tremendous disenchantment, I'll put it that way, with the Democratic Party and what they've been able to do or what they haven't been able to do. And I think that is a really critical part of the story. It doesn't translate into young Latinos are Democrats, old Latinos are Republicans. It turns into young Latinos are disengaged and feel the Democratic Party does not represent them, and they're looking for something different. Much like young white men, young white male voters, in some cases, that means voting for Trump.
It sounds good. One more question in the chat, and then we'll go over to Angel here. So the question in the chat here is, wasn't inflation the most salient issue in the Latino community that caused them to switch to Trump?
Yeah. Yes, no question. This is actually an interesting chart about voters versus non-voters and what we would expect. Let's see. That's immigration overall. I'm just looking. Geese had some really, really good charts here. This is fair. I think this is reasonable. This is from 2022 Congress, so inflation wasn't as much of an issue as it was in 24, but it was looming. Malaise about the economy was a big issue. Yes, no question. Inflation, the economy, prices, cost of living, all these things, housing, that was the most important issue for every voter. That was the most important issue for Latinos as well. That was true in 2022, true in 2024, absolutely without question. And Latinos trusted the Republicans in 2022 and Donald Trump in 2024 to deal with those issues better. Some of that is just classical retrospective voting that we know from years, decades of political science research. Voters punished the party in power because they said the economy was bad. Voters said the economy was bad, so they voted out the party in power. We know this, right? We know this. Some of that is a failure of messaging, a failure of the reality, a failure of the ability of the reality to counter the narratives that people had. You know, stock market doing really well, but prices still seem pretty high. Wages are up, but prices are up even more. That impacted Latinos too, no question. But it's a disproportionate shift among Latinos that I think says there's something special going on here. It wasn't a 1 or 2 point shift towards Republicans. It was a 9-point shift among Latino men after an 8-point shift between 2016 and 2020. That to me says there's something distinct about these populations that's not happening to the same degree with others.
Angel, do you want to come on and ask your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Or Angel, I'm sorry.
Angel's fine. Or Angel. I was just wondering if any studies had been done onto the effect of I hate the term fake news, but bad information out there. I just feel there's from my own family, and I just feel there's a really high percentage of people that are getting their information from untrustworthy sources. And I was also wondering if any thought had been done to specializing groups to target the larger population or the smaller populations within the community on outreach on what we have to gain or lose depending on who gets into office.
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me take the last part first, because I think that's really key. My sense from talking to folks is that the Democratic Party's strategy and even nonprofits, nonpartisan group strategy for a number of years, since pre-2016 even, has been when there's been outreach to Latinos. So that caveat. When there is outreach to Latinos, it is often group specific. Now, a lesson from, I think, the early 2000s maybe was that, well, you know, these populations are actually different from each other. Not everybody is Mexican, so you can't just talk about immigration. My own perspective on this is that that's gone either too far or has reached the limit of how much gain can be made with the hyper-targeted group-specific messaging, simply because there's not enough of some of these populations to say that the distinct messaging that would change their minds, even if it could, is going to shift this broader trend that we see among Latinos. So I think there was a lot of effort to like hyper target the kind of subgroups within the Latino population, when the reality, like this chart shows, is that Latinos, like other groups, really have a similar kind of set of concerns. They're just looking for someone to knock on the door, talk about it, and talk about it in a way that is kind of coherent. I think that's fair. So it's not saying don't do the micro-targeting of the groups, but it is saying combine that with an understanding of the fact that there can be similarity across the groups too, in terms of the issues they care about. The kind of first part of the question, I think, I'm trying to remember now. I think Spencer, can you remind me? I got really caught up in the second part.
Yeah, no problem. I was just focused on the next one here. So any study on bad information news?
Oh, yeah,
news sources?
misinformation.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, misinformation. That's really good. Yes, a lot on that. One of my co-authors, Yamil Velez, has done a lot of work on this. It's complicated because how do we define, misinformation, disinformation? I think Democrats in 2020, from what studies have shown, did a poor job at countering misinformation. But that misinformation is now mainstream, and there's like even worse misinformation out there. So, I mean, the nation's media landscape, particularly social media landscape, is just in tatters right now. It's just really, really, really rough. And Latinos are no exception to that. I would say that is compounded for Latinos in particular because of just difficulty in engaging with Spanish language media. Not saying they don't do it. Democrats do it. Republicans do it too. But it's just harder. It's just harder to do that. It's just a more isolated news space. And, I think there's a broader trend in misinformation in our democracy that is intensely problematic, but defining disinformation would be a first step before figuring out methods of countering it that aren't just amplifying the other side's story. And I feel like maybe just amplifying the other side's story is the best strategy for the other side to do.
And you talk about the story piece. I think Kate Starberg talks about the fact that we're kind of beyond truth telling and facts. And really right now it's about narratives and stories and what stories are most compelling here in terms of competing narratives and competing stories here. We've got another question here. Doesn't say anonymous, but does not, but it's to host and panelists. Your insights underscore the complexity of the Latino identity in the U.S. and raises a lot of other questions. From your perspective, where should research in terms of politics, public health, socioeconomic focus to help crystallize gaps and identify opportunities to address this complex demographic? And after you respond to that, I'm going to have a question for you.
Sure. I think to me, the common denominator here is that, we're collecting the data. We're probably going to see high Latino turnout. That's what we see in Georgia. But still, more than half of eligible Latinos didn't vote. So I've spent most of this talk talking about Latino switching, these conservative Latinos voting. We're still talking about a population where half of the eligible population, half of citizens of voting age, don't turn out to vote. Right? That's where the research should start. Why is that? Why is it that there's such a large share of Latinos who don't turn out to vote? And I think the answer that we'll find is that for a lot of those Latinos, this is what my research that I'm working on with the Carnegie Corporation is looking at, have actual policy views, have desires, have wishes, and even know how to register to vote, know the process, but still don't engage, don't feel like their vote makes a difference, don't like what the candidates are offering, et cetera, et cetera. So I would say more focus on the non-voters is going to be really, really key going forward, because I think it's tough to win back some of the Latinos who supported Trump, in 26, 28 and beyond.
So my question here, Bernard, here is, and maybe it's kind of like two parts. One is, okay, what does all this mean for multiracial democracy? I mean, I think some of us would say, hey, when both parties are competing for different racial groups. That's good. That's what we want. That racially polarized voting in and of itself is a problem, at least when it's along political lines. You know, is this just the tip of the iceberg and there's polarized voting below that we're not seeing here in various other races here? So like, what does all this mean in terms of multiracial democracy is kind of question one. And then question two is, I'm just not a political scientist. You know, Tanya Hernandez has written about kind of anti-Blackness within Latino communities. And a question I have just is, are we seeing that stay the same? Are we seeing that go down? Are we seeing that go up? And is there any correlation between voting patterns and any kind of racial resentment or anti-Blackness within Latino communities?
Yeah, those are really good questions. So I'll remember the first one this time, I promise. But the last one, you know, obviously in Latin America, particularly in the Caribbean, there's a long history of anti-Blackness that is often perpetuated also by Latinos who, when arriving in the US, are labeled as Black or of African origin. So I think the story there is very, very complicated and not reducible to something of like white Latinos versus Black Latinos. But, you know, anti-Blackness is real. I think, you know, when we look at the data, we see a polarization in this country. Well, there's polarization by racial group, but a much stronger polarization by racial attitudes. And Latinos are not immune to this, right? Latinos who hold anti-Black affect, which is often married to other kinds of racist views, are much, much more likely to be Republican. I think if you look at the long-term trend, my guess, right, would be that many of those Latinos were not voting before. The population is very dynamic, growing fast, so it's kind of hard to do that analysis. But the idea is, I think Trump and the Republican Party has given a voice to some of those, we'll say, racially conservative elements within the Latino population and allowed them to express their anti-Blackness in the wake of 2020, BLM, even before that, in a way that they weren't doing before, has given them a voice to be anti-Black in the same way that I think there's a substantial portion, Ashley Jardino was talking about this, of whites who are now expressing anti-Black views more than they were before. But on the other side, I think we see the opposite polarization. Many Latinos who are Democrats and support Democratic candidates understand this anti-Blackness is real, understand that there's a historical origin of this in Latin America, the Caribbean in particular, and that more work needs to be done in our communities to combat it. Implications for multiracial democracy are right there, to me. It's really saying that multiracial democracy is multiracial, right? The coalition cannot win or achieve gains for diverse communities without being fundamentally multiracial from the start in terms of who's involved, but also in terms of the policy perspectives within it. It has to be a coalition of people saying, we are stronger together than we are when we're split apart and fighting about which group gets what. And I think that in some ways, when we think about, you know, stories like coalition districts, you know, no longer, it's complicated legally, but no longer, you know, seen as a viable way of ensuring minorities have a chance of electing a candidate of choice. When we see more efforts to divide up communities politically, when we see these divisions come to the fore in public discussions even, I think it undermines the possibility of a coalition being formed, which is honestly what it's going to take to have multiracial democracy in this country. It can't be one group alone. There's just not the numbers.
Yep. Okay. All right. So as we wrap up, I want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you also, Professor Fraga, for your presentation, your engagement. Thanks also to our executive director, Lisa Bornstein, for her leadership in organizing this event. We look forward to seeing many of you next month on Thursday, February 13th with Princeton professor Ishmael White, who will talk about Black voters, and then again in March with UC San Diego professor Zoli Heinel. We'll talk about racially polarized voting. So thank you all so much. Appreciate it.